if there's one fighter I don't want Devin Haney fighting, it's probably Brian Norman Jr. You know, he just put on a hell of a knockout performance against Jin Sasaki, and it was kind of scary, kind of like a silent moment, because we didn't know, you know, if that dude was gonna get up. It was definitely a concerning moment for, you know, the sport of boxing, and it was just a hellacious knockout, like a nasty KO that Norman scored over Sasaki. You know, he just didn't have enough to keep up with Brian Norman, wasn't on his level. But, you know, Devin, it just made me think, you know, Devin, you know, talks about Brian Norman, said he's not that good, you know, to say the least, just didn't have a lot to say about Brian Norman in a positive light. And it just made me think, like, if Brian Norman and Devin Haney fought, I can't help but, you know, think Devin's probably gonna get stopped in that fight, just because Norman's like a grown man. It's just different. You know, I'm not saying that Devin can't make 140, because obviously he said multiple times, and I've seen Devin try to make 140 in person, you know, and he just can't do it. And I understand that, but like, there's also levels to 147. You know, he's never fought at the welterweight division, and then to be fighting a guy like Brian Norman, who, you know, physically, I know he's young, but physically, you look at Brian Norman, I don't think Devin Haney can deal with that. You know, even though Devin Haney's in great shape at all times, you know, he doesn't get tired, has great conditioning, is a mover for the most part, or at least as of recent. You know, Brian Norman has the ability to catch a guy like Devin Haney and land something crazy, and I just don't know if Devin's chin would hold up to that, because I think Brian Norman probably hits harder than anyone Devin Haney's ever faced. Even that Ryan Garcia left hook, you know, Brian Norman might be stronger. You know, I think he is stronger, because we're talking about a natural and full-fledged 147 pounder in Brian Norman. So I don't like that fight for Devin. You know, I'd prefer Devin goes the route of even a Teofimo Lopez, still an explosive and athletic fighter, but physically he might be a little bit easier to deal with as opposed to Brian Norman, because you just look at Sasaki in there, you know, they both weighed in at 147, but it was just a different, you know, beast in there. You know, Sasaki might have weighed 147, but Brian Norman looked way bigger than Sasaki, and that was apparent in the fight. Sasaki was doing his best to try to land shots, and he landed some decent shots that maybe caught the attention of Brian Norman, but nothing to the point where it completely got the respect of Norman. And that's the most important thing in the sport of boxing. If you can't get the respect, you're in trouble. You know, it's not about whether or not Sasaki had the courage to be a warrior and continue to go at Brian Norman, because he did just that. It just wasn't enough against the guy who didn't really feel the power to the extent where he had to second guess, you know, whether or not he was going to try to punch with Sasaki. You know, he just landed that shot, cracked him with a left hook, and that was all she wrote. You know, Sasaki's head bounced off the canvas, and that was that. They had to carry him out on a stretcher. So, you know, he just put the whole welterweight division on notice who the top dog is at 147, especially with Boots moving up to 54. I feel like Brian Norman's a problem for anybody. Devin Haney, you got Richardson Hitchens probably going to move up to 47, Teofimo Lopez, Ryan Garcia, Rolly Romero, all of these dudes, I don't think they want that Brian Norman work though, because even though they're older than him, Brian Norman's a dangerous fight for any of those guys, and I don't know if I favor any of, you know, the Devin Haneys of the world, the Rolly Romeros of the world, or the Ryan Garcias, Teofimo Lopez. I don't know if I favor any of those guys against Brian Norman. You're talking a big, full-fledged 147 pounder who's athletic, who can punch, who can time you, he can counter, he can do it all. You know, he's honestly a dangerous fighter. Do I think, you know, he's the best fighter in the world? Not yet. I think, you know, he still needs to be tested by more elite opposition, but from what I'm seeing, he's very dangerous, very athletic, and, you know, his timing is great. So I feel like Norman is definitely a problem for anybody that he fights. He's a handful for, you know, the best, even the best in the world. You know, a guy like Boots, he said in his post-fight interview that, you know, everybody runs from the storm, they put their boots on and they go running, you know, so I feel like that was a great call out. It was definitely a shot at Boots, but I feel like they've already tried to make the fight happen, so that's, you know, Boots's alibi, or at least his defense, is that they tried to make the fight happen. Norman allegedly, you know, priced himself out, so we'll see what happens at, you know, 54 if Boots really doesn't come down, you know, or stay at 147, intends on moving up to 54. Potentially, we're going to see that fight at 54. I wouldn't sweat it too much. You know, I'm hopeful that we get that fight, because I feel like Norman's not a little 47 pounder. He's huge. I'm sure that 47 pound weight cut isn't easy for him either. So I could imagine, you know, Norman and you know, Boots Ennis get active at 154, and that'd be a hell of a fight. I don't know who wins that one, but, you know, I'd lean towards Boots just because, you know, he seems to be the more talented fighter, but I would say and argue that, you know, he's not necessarily more athletic than Brian Norman, and I'm not saying, you know, he hits harder than Norman either. You know, I think Norman probably does hit harder between the two, but Boots maybe has the better reflexes, and maybe that's what makes the difference. So, you know, Boots and Brian Norman, tremendous fight. But let me know in the comments if you guys think one is ducking the other, if Boots is ducking Norman, or if Norman's ducking Boots. But still a hell of a fight at 154. But thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys on the next Nabs Boxing video. Peace.